Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm your host Brian. Thank you for watching. Today we are having an interview with Ben Kissling, who recently wrote a paper on theistic evolution. He's waiting for it to be published in Journal of Creation, and but he is going to be talking with us today on what is called mere theistic evolution, where theistic evolutionists have certain common views they're agreed upon among every theistic evolutionist, and he's going to be responding to that and showing you why it is internally inconsistent and absurd. And so we're going to deal with that here in a little bit. And without further ado, let's dive in. Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm your host Brian, and I'm here today again with Ben Kissling, who's been on my channel before, discussing arguments and responses to William Lane Craig's book on the historical Adam. And today we're going to be talking about theistic evolution and responding to certain arguments made by theistic evolutionists. And Ben, how you been doing? And would you like to just kind of briefly tell people who you are and what your background is and your interest in this particular subject?
Okay, so I have actually just recently graduated with a master's in science and religion from Biola University, and I've been studying this topic a long time. Um, on this particular topic, I have been sick for the past couple of weeks, so I might have to take a break now and then to cough or clear my throat, but that's how I've been doing. Um, As for this particular topic, I have an article that I believe should be coming out soon in the Journal of Creation, um, called Mere Theistic Evolution Fails to Reconcile Evolution and Creation. If it's not already out, I think their first issue of the year is out, but it's not in that one. I think it's going to be in the second one. Um, so this article is responding to another article by a couple of theistic evolutionists named Michael Murray and John Churchill. And in turn, they are responding to this book called, no, it's going to be backwards, looks like, but Theistic Evolution, which is a book put out broadly by intelligent design type people. So it's got Stephen Meyer, uh, J.P. Moreland, Wayne Grudem, who's more of an old Earth creationist. And so Murray and Churchill wrote this argument to respond to this book, and their goal appears to have been to um, give an account of mere theistic evolution, so what all theistic evolutionists believe and agree on, um, and also to reconcile what I think is the biggest problem with theistic evolution, and that is the incompatibility between the Darwinian mechanism of evolution, particularly the random mutation part of it, with the Christian doctrine of creation. And Murray and Churchill provided an interesting and I think novel attempt to resolve that seeming incompatibility that I don't think has been responded to very well. There was a meeting at the 2019 Evangelical Philosophical Society. That's a conference that Murray and Churchill presented this paper at, and Stephen Meyer and Paul Nelson and William Lane Craig were all there. And I just didn't think that they responded very well to Murray and Churchill's position. So I've been thinking about it for quite a while and wrote this paper to respond to them. So mere theistic evolution, they define it. They give three parts to it. So they say these are the things that all theistic evolutionists agree on, and this is the definition of theistic evolution. And I generally agree with it. So number one, and this is my paraphrase because their definitions in their paper, each one of these points is like a whole paragraph long. So I shortened it and paraphrased it. Number one is God exists. He is the creator, and he is omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, as well as possessing other divine attributes. So this is just the the God of classical theism. Okay. Number two, the created universe is extremely old, and they give approximate ages of 14 billion years for the universe and about 4 billion years for the Earth. It's just approximate. So, old Earth, God exists, the Christian God exists, the Judeo-Christian God. Number two, the Earth is old. And number three, natural selection acting upon random mutation, that's the Darwinian mechanism, along with other national processes, is both the best current explanation and also, in general, a good explanation of the complexity and diversity of life. So, in general, they think that Darwinian evolution is a good scientific theory and currently the best scientific theory. Now, interestingly, and we might get into this later on, is they don't actually say in their definition that in order to be a theistic evolutionist, you must believe that the Darwinian theory is true. Okay. And when I say true, I mean true in the correspondence sense of truth. It's called the correspondence theory of truth, meaning that something is true if it corresponds to reality. Okay. Now, they don't discuss that much in the paper, but this will become relevant when we talk about their attempt to solve what I think is a contradiction between points one and three. Three. Um, so if God is the creator in the Christian sense, that means, I think, uh, at least two things. So I think theistic evolution has a problem in reconciling Murray and Churchill's point number one and point God is the creator and Darwinian evolution. So I have sort of defined the doctrine of creation, the Christian doctrine of creation, using 2 points. Number one is prior to creating any created thing, God created in his mind a blueprint for that created thing. So he's thinking in his mind, here's what I'm going to create. And number two, God has to actually create the created thing according to the blueprint that he planned in his mind. And this is the key point, without any possibility of his failing to do so. Now, what that means is that if God determines I'm going to create something, he must actually succeed at creating it, and he can't there can't be a possibility of him failing to create it. Otherwise, he's rolling the dice, and this is not the Judeo-Christian God. This is not the God of the Bible. This is not the God that any Christian believes in, including Murray and Churchill or any theistic evolutionist who is actually a Christian. Okay. Um, God cannot fail to do what he purposes himself to do. That would be a failure of his omnipotence, right? And that's explicitly mentioned by Murray and Churchill in their definition of mere theistic evolution. Okay, so I argue that the Darwinian mechanism, understood straightforwardly as in the correspondent sense of truth, flatly contradicts this, that because the Darwinian mechanism appeals to probabilistic mechanisms or probabilistic models of mutations, there's a chance that the mutations could do this or that or anything. And that means that given the specificity required for the origin of the diversity of life on Earth, including human beings, um, there a probabilistic model of mutations is not sufficient to guarantee any outcome. Okay. Um, and that means that if God used evolution to create, then he could have failed in achieving his intended outcome. There was a possibility that he could have failed. Because what we would say is that in order for God to have no possibility of failing, the probability of God achieving his intended outcome would have to be one. And I say that Darwinian evolution, if it's the true account of the origin and history of life, would mean that the probability that God achieves his intended outcome, were he using evolution to create, would be less than one because of the way that mutations are modeled in the theory. Okay, so that's the basic argument.
Okay, awesome.
Is there
Yes. With this is supposed to come out in the Journal of Creation.
Yep,
Awesome.
I
All
have
right.
the final version of it right here with me. They have page numbers and everything, so
Right. And you sent it to me as well. I haven't had time to actually go over it though. Um, and okay, have you talked to other theistic evolutionists about your position, and have they come up with any kind of like criticisms that they have an issue with something that you said or anything like that that you want to address on that?
the only people I've really talked to about this would be like on Twitter or something like that. Um, and I they will deny that it's a problem in various ways. And this is kind of the problem in general with theistic evolution is I think part of the problem that Murray and Churchill are trying to resolve here is that the way that theistic evolutionists try to resolve this issue kind of depends on the theistic evolutionists. There's not a universal a method for resolving this issue. But as for me talking to any major or well-known theistic evolutionists, that hasn't happened um, yet. Hopefully, that could happen. I would hope. But there's been many attempts to do this kind of thing to solve this same problem. So, for example, um, uh, a theistic evolutionist named Ken Miller about 20 years ago basically tried to use quantum mechanics to resolve the issue by saying that um, natural law does not prevent God from intervening in nature to collapse the wave function, basically. So if
Is that
quantum
right?
mechanics, if you take the, yeah, if you take the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics, it basically means that subatomic particles are governed by probabilistic equations. That's just what quantum mechanics is. But if you take sort of a what I would call a realist interpretation of quantum mechanics, that kind of indicates that um, there's probabilities at the quantum level that essentially means the position and momentum and or momentum of a subatomic particle is at least somewhat uncaused, meaning it just happens one way versus the other way at any given time. And the only rules that govern it are probabilistic. So, for example, if you flipped a bunch of coins, let's say you flipped a coin 100 times in a row, probabilistically, you there would not be a determined head or tails for every coin flip. I mean, it would just them, meaning uncaused. There's nothing causing it to be turn up heads or tails. It just has to be one or the other. Um, but over 100 coin flips, you would expect close to a 50-50 distribution in the total number of heads versus tails. So that's kind of how like probabilistic rules work in quantum mechanics. And if you take a realist interpretation of that, it implies that subatomic particles that make up everything um, um, are probabilistic in that way. And so what Ken Miller tried to do was say that because the rules governing all these subatomic particles are probabilistic, that means God can intervene and cause very particular specific things to happen without being able to be detected by the scientific method. So if you were if you could watch certain quantum events play out, you would not be able to tell that God was intervening in nature and causing certain things to happen because no laws of nature are being broken, right? Um, and therefore God can intervene in nature and be the creator for real, but science cannot detect his action in the world. That was Miller's basic idea. And so the idea is basically that there's no scientific argument for God being the creator. So that means you can, as a Christian, understand the history of life on Earth in a 100% the same way that an atheist would, an atheist evolutionist would. But you could believe on faith that God was guiding the process, just that you can't detect it scientifically. Now, I think the problem with that is going to be the same problem with Murray and Churchill's argument, which I'll get into, which is kind of similar in a way, but they don't mention quantum mechanics. Um, the problem is that in order to get the kind of information that we see in biological life, um, of such a very specific sequence of events, of say the quantum events, would have to occur in order to achieve that outcome among a massive number of possible sets of quantum events that could have occurred. Meaning that the probability that randomly you would just get life the way we see it today is so low that we can exclude chance as a hypothesis. And what that means is, so Miller might say that, well, we can believe that God created it, but we just can't tell, right? Whereas an intelligent design theorist would say, no, we can tell precisely because of the probabilistic arguments that intelligent design theory makes. You can tell that something is designed because of the way the low probability of an event plus high specification. That's the basic design inference. But I would go further than that and argue that um, with my argument that in order for God to achieve his intended outcome, the probability of him achieving this outcome had to be one. And so you can't depend on probabilistic arguments if you're a Christian who thinks that, human beings, for example, as we currently exist, were intended by God. Um, you have to believe that God achieved his intended outcome with a probability of one, which means you have to disagree with any um, scientific argument that is relevant to the origin and complexity of life, which appeals to probabilities of less than one. And quantum mechanics would be included in that. Okay, this is actually precisely the reason why so many Christians, Christian philosophers reject the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's because it removes God as the creator, essentially. Um, Now, the weird thing about Murray and Churchill and the circles that they run in is that most of them seem to take a deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics for precisely that reason. And so one question I would love to ask them is why do you think it's so necessary to take that kind of interpretation of quantum mechanics from a Christian perspective? And if the answer is, well, we can't appeal to probabilities because probabilities of less than one remove God as the creator, well, that the same thing is true of evolution. Um, and the thing about this paper by Murray and Churchill, I never mentioned the name of it. It's just called Mere Theistic Evolution, as published in Philosophia Christi in 2020. And the thing about it is they come so close um, to sort of admitting this in the paper. It's really actually a difficult paper to read. I've been thinking about this paper now for 5, 6 years, and every time I read it, it's like I'm like, I'm not sure what they even mean. Um, so um, what they s- what they say in the paper is that probabilities are not real, or they're not absolute, in other words. So if anything is a probability, that's not correct. Okay, so they appear to be theistic determinists who think that all events are known at least by God. Since they're probably Molinists, they wouldn't say determined by God, but what they would say, uh, the probability of every single quantum event since the beginning of time, 14 billion years ago, right? Every probability is actually one. Now, they don't say that in the paper, and I wish they had because that would have been more clear. Um, that's what I take them to mean, is that the probability of every single quantum event in the history of everything is actually one because God ordained it somehow. Now, either you think God determined it, sort of like a full-blown Calvinist, or you're some kind of Molinist who thinks that, well, he didn't determine everything, but he chose the feasible world in which all these things would occur to create. He created, chose among all the different feasible worlds that fit his criteria, um, and then picked one and said, "This is the one that's gonna happen." Okay. So either way, though, you're saying that the probability of every single event is really one. Now, what they talk about is they say that probabilities are relevant to background knowledge. And that's true, okay? So, for example, if I was God and I was looking at you or me flipping 100 coins in a row, I would know exactly the outcome of every single one of those 100 coin flips, right? And this is the illustration they use in the paper. They talk about coin flips a lot. Um, And so, from God's background knowledge, from the knowledge, God's omniscience, right? He knows everything, including, he would know the outcome of all those coin flips. And therefore, from God's perspective, with God's maximal knowledge, right, his omniscience, the probability of the first coin flip being heads is one. The probability of the second coin flip being tails is one. All the probabilities are really one from God's perspective, even though from our perspective as human beings, because we don't know the outcome ahead of time, we would model those probabilities as one half or 50%, right? 50-50. It could be heads half the time, it could be tails half the time, we don't know. Okay, so what they try to argue is that um, because probabilities are relevant to background knowledge, that means they're relative. Probabilities are not absolute truths, they're relative truths. They're relative to background knowledge. Okay. And they appear to be arguing that this means that evolutionary theory is fine and we can accept it, I guess, is would be the term, maybe the word they would use. Because from our perspective, right, we have to model these processes like random mutations as having a probability of less than one, when from God's background knowledge, God's maximal background knowledge, the probabilities would all be one. Okay, following so far?
Yeah. I do have a question on theistic evolutionists because theistic evolution assumes that God somehow is involved in the creative process, whereas evolution claims that this is a random chance, where everything just kind of through basically a claim of trial and error, pretty much, where you got like this right here doesn't work, so this is thrown out. This right here does work, so this progresses, and then all this eventually gets to all life on Earth. And so I'm curious, how do theistic evolutionists reconcile the idea that God acted in evolution would assume a not a blind chance situation, but yet evolution itself presumes a very blind chance, randomness kind of interaction there, where everything is just kind of trial and error for millions of years. So, how do theistic evolutionists reconcile those two contradictions?
Yeah, I they have different attempts of doing this. Francis Collins, for example, in his 2006 book, The Language of God, um, suggested that because God is outside of time, that solves the problem somehow. Um, I don't think that was a really well thought out solution. Another one I mentioned was Ken Miller. Um, Yeah, I don't think they can solve that problem. So you're probably asking the wrong person. Um, uh, but Murray and Churchill's solution seems to be that probabilities are not real. And so it doesn't make any sense to say that evolutionary theory is quote unquote wrong or something because it's appealing to probabilities. Why? Because it's relevant to our background knowledge as human beings. Whereas the real probability of one is only from God's background knowledge. And so they seem to be making an epistemology argument that uh, epistemologically we can only know uh, a model that works with probabilities of less than one, like random mutations. But God, because he's God, can know the full truth, the actual real, what is actually happening is the probability according to God's perspective that I'm going to ensure that my creative intent is the actual outcome, right? It actually happens. But only God can know that, right? In this sense, I think their argument resembles an argument that was made by Stephen Jay Gould, who was a famous evolutionary biologist at Harvard and also an atheist. Um, he made a similar kind of argument that he called non-overlapping magisteria in his book called Rock of Ages. And I think he wrote a paper earlier than that also. But Gould was basically saying that you have the magisterium on the one hand of science, and then you have the magisterium of religion, and never the twain shall meet. In other words, they don't have any overlap, non-overlapping magisteria. Okay. So when science makes some determination about one thing, religion or theology is never making any determination about the thing that science is making a determination about, or vice versa. Right? So when theology makes a proper claim, that's a properly theological claim, science can't make any claims about that thing. Does that make sense? So you have these two spheres, right, where we have two separate knowledge disciplines, and they're both making truth claims, but those truth claims can never contradict each other because they can never properly make truth claims about the same thing. Okay? Now, there's part of Murray and Churchill's paper where they seem to make a similar argument, where they're talking about background knowledge, right? They're talking about background knowledge of human beings, which is what we must use for science, and the background knowledge available to God, which is what we would presumably use in theology. So they have two different sets of knowledge that are being utilized by the two different disciplines. So I think this makes, if this is what they mean, this this makes their solution very similar to Gould's, is non-overlapping magisteria, or it's called NOMA. Um, and that I think would not be acceptable, probably even to Murray and Churchill, but to most theistic evolutionists. I don't think that's an acceptable solution. Um, but they talk sort of like that, right? They separate the disciplines of science and theology by basically saying we have to use two different sets of background knowledge. Um, there's an interesting quote here. Uh, let's see if I can find it. Ah, here it is. Okay. So this is a quote from Murray and Churchill's paper. They say, but assuming that we lacked knowledge of God's intentions for this mutation and those to follow, as well as knowledge of all relevant physical facts in each case, the right probability to assign a beneficial mutation would have been zero point 0.5. I cut out a little ellipses there, but so what they're saying is if we lack God's maximal knowledge, God's omniscience, then the right probability of for a coin flip is zero point 0.5 or one half. Okay? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to say that the probabilistic way of modeling mutations is right, whatever they mean by that, um, with our non-divine background knowledge. Okay? Now, this is why I want to talk about this in terms of the correspondence theory of truth. Because what does right mean? If you're interpreting right as meaning true, corresponding to reality, then it doesn't matter what knowledge we do or do not lack. There's only one true probability for the coin flip, and that's one. If God knows it to be one, right? So the question is whether or not they essentially mean that we're supposed to interpret probabilities of less than one in a non-realistic or anti-realistic way. Okay? If that's what they meant, then they're also having to interpret not just quantum mechanics, but also evolutionary theory in an anti-realist sense. Or another term for that might be instrumentalist sense. And this is where we get into philosophy of science. Okay. Now, this is not in their paper, but I think it's sort of implied by it. And this is another a question I want to ask them. Are you interpreting probabilities of less than one in an anti-realist sense? Meaning we use probabilities of less than one in scientific models of the world, not because they're true in the correspondence sense, because all probabilities are one, because God knows all things, right? But rather we're using it because it works to make a good model. And the term they use in the paper is predictively accurate. Okay. But the thing they seem to gloss over in the paper is that just flat out means that you're saying evolutionary theory is not true in the correspondent sense of truth. And I wish that they would either admit that or deny it, and then I would be saying their argument is a little is it doesn't make sense, is contradictory. Um, so my suspicion is they're kind of between a rock and a hard place here, because I don't think they want to say that evolutionary theory is not true in the correspondence sense, because that would sound like not a theistic evolutionist position, right? Most people who call themselves theistic evolutionists do believe that the Darwinian evolutionary story is true in the correspondence sense. It's a true account of history. And the the problem with the doctrine of creation surrounds this exact issue. Is it true in the correspondence sense that mutations have a probability of less than one? If not, then that means that the doctrine of creation can be true because the relevant probabilities are all one, but the theory of evolution cannot be true in the same sense. It can't be true in the correspondence sense because it explicitly appeals to probabilities of less than one. And if those probabilities don't actually exist, then the theory cannot be true. Now, remember why I said at the beginning when I was going over the definition that Murray and Churchill gave for mere theistic evolution? I noted that when they talk about Darwinian theory, that's their point number three, natural selection acting upon random mutations, they don't say that it's true. They say that it is a good explanation for the complexity and diversity of life. Okay? They say it is the best current explanation and a very good explanation in general. They don't say that it's true. Okay? So to me, this sounds like an anti-realist interpretation of evolutionary theory. If you're not going to claim that Darwinian evolution is true, what are you claiming? You're claiming that it's a good explanation. You're claiming it might be the best current explanation. And that's fully compatible with the anti-realist or instrumentalist view of the theory of evolution. The
It'd be like
problem
the
is they probably know most. What's that?
I was gonna say it'd be like they're saying that it's possibly true, but we can't guarantee that it is, kind of thing.
No, not possibly true. That's actually a realist position. Possible truth or approximate truth are both realist positions. They would be saying, so um, so to explain instrumentalism a little bit, it's like an instrument, right? Like I use the analogy of a hammer. Okay, if I can use a hammer as a tool to pound in a nail, right? And if it does a good job at pounding the nail, it's well balanced and it's weighted correctly and doesn't break when I use it. I can say that's a good tool, right? But I wouldn't say that the hammer is true in some sort of absolute sense of corresponding to reality, right? That doesn't even make sense. It's like a category error, unless you're a Platonist, where you think there's some tr perfect hammer that is in the Platonic form, realm of forms, right? And all hammers that actually exist are some kind of shadow of the perfect hammer, right? Unless you're a Platonist. If you're not a Platonist, you might say that, look, just doesn't make sense to say that a hammer is true or false the way we would say something, a propositional statement is true or false. Like, Jesus is God would be a propositional statement that I believe is true, right? Um, but a propositional statement like that is either true or false. It is either true that Jesus is God or not true that Jesus is God. But it doesn't seem to be the same for saying something like a hammer. A hammer is true, a hammer is false. That doesn't make sense because the existence of a hammer isn't really like a propositional statement, right? And so the anti-realist philosophy of science would say that scientific theories are more like hammers than propositional statements. Okay. So they might work well. They might do a good job at what we need them to do. Like a theory of gravity might do a good job at modeling how gravity works. Um, but it doesn't make sense to say that they're propositionally true or false. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of, but don't the theories actually make propositional statements?
Um, it depends on your philosophy of science. So if you're a realist, you would interpret it realistically and say that yes, it does make propositional statements. So you'd say, and this is why, like their especially their point number two, when they don't qualify it the same way they qualify point number three. When they say the universe is extremely old and it's around 14 billion years for the universe and 4 billion years for the Earth. That's a propositional statement. They're saying this is the case. This corresponds to what's really true. Okay, evolutionary theory that way as well, as a realist theory, where you'd say it is true that, we descended from apes, or it is true that mutations are probabilistic, meaning chance or trial and error, as you put it. That really is the way that we all came to be. That's a realist interpretation of the theory. Whereas an anti-realist interpretation would say, no, it's not actually meant to be corresponding to what actually occurred or what's actually true. Rather, it is a mental model that we use to make sense of data, right, that we can observe. So I can see today human beings and chimpanzees, and I can come up with this mental model of how they could be related by a process of natural selection and mutation. But you're doing that to make sense of the genetic differences and similarities between the two genomes. You're not doing it because you think it actually occurred that way. So, um, so maybe a good way to talk about this is in terms of different theories of gravity. So you did you take high school physics?
Yeah.
Yeah, so most people did. If you went through high school, you probably learned about Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. And you learned all these equations, right? With velocity and acceleration, distance, and all that stuff. Okay. This is actually a pretty good theory of gravity. It's how we went to the moon. They used Newtonian mechanics, it's called, to go to the moon, to calculate the trajectory of the spacecraft being pulled by the gravity from Earth and the gravity from the moon, and using enough right thrust to get it to the right trajectory and to go around the moon and land on the moon. Okay, they used Newtonian theory to do that. The problem is that Newtonian theory is inaccurate in certain very specialized cases.
Like
And
in relativity.
Albert Einstein, yes, he came up with a theory called general relativity that turned out to be more accurately describing what we observe in the world um, in these very specific edge cases. So, for example, in 1920, Arthur Eddington went to a small island in the Atlantic. I think it was like the Maldives or something, and he observed uh, the slight difference in position of the light from stars right next to the sun during an eclipse. Okay. And the reason they needed to have an eclipse for this is because the only play the only place where the light from distant stars would be expected to be bent in its path by the gravity of the sun, which is something that Einstein predicted using general relativity that Newtonian mechanics does not predict.
Right. They call it
Okay.
gravitational
You
lensing.
need that eclipse.
Gravitational
Yeah,
lensing.
exactly. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So you need that eclipse because um, you have to have the light from the sun blocked so you can actually see the starlight that's beyond it. Okay. And so Arthur Eddington made this observation, right? And he saw, okay, here's where I would calculate the star to be, the star's position, if I was using Newtonian mechanics. That is assuming that the light doesn't get bent by the sun. And here's where I would calculate the star's position to be using general relativity. And then what you can do is you compare that position to a different time in the year when the starlight is not going so close to the sun. And they found that Einstein's predictions were more accurate than Newton's predictions. Okay, so why did I go through all this? Because let's let's say you're taking a realist interpretation of scientific theories like Newtonian mechanics versus Einstein's general relativity. Okay. The problem is that in Newtonian mechanics, Newton models gravity as though it is a force that is generated by mass and that acts at a distance on other masses. Einstein's version of gravity is not a force at all. It's literally just a feature of how space-time itself curves geometrically around masses. Okay? So, to simplify everything, Newton's theory says makes a if you interpret it realistically as making propositional statements like we were talking about before, Newton's theory would say gravity is a force. Einstein's theory would say gravity is not a force. So they can't both be true, okay? Because it's a direct, one is a negation of the other. This is A and not A, right? It's Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. You cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same sense, okay? And of course, the position of the star calculated by whether the light bends or not would be another example of that. They would say the actual propositionally true position of the star is this, according to Newton's theory, and it is that, according to Einstein's theory, and the two are incompatible. Okay? They cannot both be true. Okay? So the question is, what do you do with something like Newtonian mechanics? If you say Einstein's theory of general relativity is the true theory because it's more accurate, or we think it's more accurate, right? We made predictions and they turned out to be correct. Okay. That means if you're a real scientific realist, you would have to simply say that Newtonian mechanics is false. And it seems that seems okay to most people at first. Well, okay, it's false. It's a good theory, but it's just false. Um, the problem is when you start thinking about it a little deeper. So in a since we're talking about theology, in a discipline like theology, if I made a propositional statement that was false, would I then try to use that propositional statement because it's a good theory? So let's say I said something like, Jesus is not God. Well, we don't want to do that because that's propositionally false, or we believe it to be propositionally false. And that means it's bad theology. Okay? So and so we don't want to even think about it. We want to just say that's just false. We're throwing that away, right? And this is why you hear so many people saying this is bad science or it's not science, right? We would say the propositional statement, Jesus is not God, is bad theology or it's not theology at all. It's certainly not Christian theology, right? And so if we want to say that about scientific theories, that they are meant to be propositional statements that are either true or false, we would have to then say the same thing about Newtonian mechanics. We would have to say this theory is propositionally false. That means it's either bad science or not science at all, and we should just throw it out. We should not think about it anymore. The problem is in science, it just seems to be the case that there doesn't seem to be a good reason to do that. Um, Case in point, when the Apollo missions were planning their trips to the moon, they used Newtonian mechanics. If Newtonian mechanics was propositionally false, that should have been a bad idea if the realist interpretation of the theory is correct, right? They should have ended up shooting past the moon or, you know, doing something horrible or it would have been bad, right? But in science, what appears to be the case is you can use theories that are not propositionally true and be fine. Does that make sense? In
Yeah.
fact, there's a the reason the reason that they used Newtonian mechanics instead of Einstein's theory of relativity is that the math was easier. Okay? Now, would you say the same thing in theology? Would you say in theology, well, we can say Jesus is not God in theology because it's just easier that way, right? It doesn't seem to work the same way.
So you're
But
saying
in
in
science, it
science
seems
that
to be fine. We use Newton.
right. You're saying it's science. It's more about practical application of it. Like certain applications work better under certain situations and conditions, while in others might work better. Um, and that sort of thing. So, in Newtonian physics, it works really good to plan your trip to the moon using that type of thing. But when it comes to gravitational lensing and effects that gravity might have on things, it's better to use Einstein's relativity and that sort of thing. And so it's just a matter of practical application.
Exactly. Um, and so when I say you can use a theory to give yourself to make predictions, for example, that is not the same thing as saying the theory must be true in the correspondence sense. And so, what I am trying to tease out here is that it looks like Murray and Churchill are taking an anti-realist view of the theory of evolution, which means they're just accepting that it's not true in the correspondence sense of truth. But they're saying it still works well to make accurate predictions as a scientific model. Now, that would be a coherent position because that removes the contradiction between the doctrine of creation and the theory of evolution, right? Because if you're saying the doctrine of creation is true in the correspondence sense, meaning all probabilities are one, um, and the theory of evolution, which clearly says that not all probabilities are one, in fact, there are probabilities used in the theory that are less than one. They cannot both be true in the correspondence sense of truth. But if you're not actually saying that, if you're saying The doctrine of creation is true. Theory of evolution is not true in the correspondence sense. It's just a good scientific theory. That removes the contradiction. Okay. So what I would like to do is I would like to get them to explicitly say this and explain that that is their position. Because if it is, that's a workable position. But you have to admit that you're saying the theory of evolution is not true in the correspondence sense. And they do not say that in the paper. Okay?
Okay. We
So,
would.
and you can see why
I was going to say we would
you
accept
can
like. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
Okay. I was going to
I was
say
just going to finish up and say that
it's
we
overlap
must
with the
have some serious,
internet. Yeah, it's delay. It's
yeah.
okay. I'll try to edit it out, smooth it up a little bit. But I was going to sit there and say, okay, in the case of the examples we gave, practical applications, because Newtonian physics works well under certain conditions. Relativity works well under other conditions. But in case of evolution, you're dealing with something that doesn't seem to work really well, and or it like for example, in the case of evolution would make failed predictions like they predicted the Y chromosome would be start out the same size as the X chromosome and have the same percentage similarity. Now there's a paper that came out a couple years back that showed that the Y chromosome was only like 26% similar between chimps and humans. And so it winds up being that evolution is not working very well. It can't explain the origin of life, which even evolutionists admit is um, a mystery that they still have not been able to solve, figure out how to get life out of non-living material. And so when it comes to evolution, uh, the theistic evolutionists might think that like the evolutionists do, that it works well, but then when you actually examine it, it doesn't seem like it works very well with what we're discovering, what's the data is, and that sort of thing. It doesn't seem to best explain what we know. I mean, in terms of that. In fact, if anything, it throws up more questions like how did life begin, and that sort of thing. And then you have to assume that somehow God interacted with that process um, to randomly uh, uh, position everything so that evolution will work out, which to me doesn't seem to make any sense because it's like you're saying that evolution is random, but yet with purpose. It's like someone saying that yes, it's by chance, but I intended it that way. So it's like okay, what's going on there? So it doesn't seem to work really well to me in terms of what we actually know. You know what I'm saying?
I do, and I would agree with all of that, right? I don't think evolution is a good theory. I think it's a failed theory, and there's a better theory. There's a few better theories, okay? But that's not the point that I'm making here. That's not the point I'm making in the paper. I would make the same point, and I would make it elsewhere, and I would cite all kinds of evidence like you just did, for example. So that would be a disagreement between us as creationists and theistic evolutionists, right? We would just disagree that it's a good theory. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that even on the theistic evolutionists' own terms, it doesn't work theologically with the Christian doctrine of creation if you think the theory is true in the correspondence sense. So, what I'm trying to argue to theistic evolutionists without trying to persuade them that's a bad theory, which I would try to do in other contexts, but in this context, I am trying to say to them, granting it's a good theory, you still must believe that it's false, or else the Christian doctrine of creation is false in the correspondence sense. So
Okay.
I'm making an internal critique of theistic evolution by saying if you believe theist evolution is true and the Christian doctrine of creation is true, you believe a contradiction and you cannot believe that. You have to say one or the other is false. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Before we getting there closer to the end, I didn't want to keep you too long. You look like you're pretty sick. You seem to able to control your coughing a little bit more. Um, but I do wanted to delve into some specifics concerning other theistic evolutionists regarding um, like uh, like you said that like in mere theistic evolution, the idea is to say, okay, this is certain things that are common that all evolutionists take. Now, of course, from what I understand, theistic evolutionists differ quite extensively on various things, various viewpoints, and they're constantly debating each other on their views of it. I guess because they differ on how they try to reconcile the Bible with these with evolutionary views, and so they differ on how they try to reconcile that. And you got different famous theistic evolutionists. You got John Walton's view. You got William Lane Craig's view. I know Michael Jones, who's has a YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy, who you've responded to before. And he has his own kind of what I like to call a Frankenstein sort of view. He just kind of takes bits and pieces that he likes from different theistic evolutionists and puts them together, and then rejects all the parts that he doesn't. So I call it a kind of a Frankenstein view. What would be your response to some of these specific objections? Have you studied, for example, John Walton's? I don't have his. Well, I've got one of them right here. Books on John Walton. I got several of John Walton's books. Which one I got here?
Lost
Oh,
world.
yeah, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. Is one I got here. I also got The Lost World of Genesis 1 and one on the flood that he made. So what would be like some specifics that we can kind of point to? Because I know that John Walton differs with William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig differs with John Walton, and that sort of thing. So we know that they have these kinds of differences. Um, but what would you? Because I John Walton's position is that he thinks that creation of Genesis 1 was kind of functional. You know what I'm saying? It's all about function. Now, from what I gather, and I think William LeCraig actually has a pretty good critique of John Walton's position on this. It is the either or fallacy. It's like either it's functional or it's about material, or it could be about both. Actually, it's not one or the other. But what would what would be your assessment? Was that your assessment that he's making the either or fallacy? Either it's functional or it's materialistic, and he doesn't realize it's really both kind of thing.
Um, I haven't read Walton's book. I haven't read Lost World of Genesis 1. I need to. But I'm familiar with the functional creation claim. Um, I'm not sure what I think that's mostly just a biblical interpretation thing, in my view, is like I don't think he's interpreting Genesis 1 correctly. Um, that that to say that, well, God said, "Let there be light," and it was so, you know, that and God said, "Let us make man in our own image," and then it says he went and did it. Like this to me reflects the definition of the doctrine of creation that I gave, where there's the first part where God says in his mind, I'm going to make a blueprint of what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, here's what I'm going to do. And then number two, I go and do it, right?
Right.
What Walton's functional creation view seems to imply is that actually God said in his mind, I'm going to do this thing called the Big Bang a long, long time ago. And everything that I'm actually doing in creation is happening at that very initial moment. And then, billions of years later, I'm coming along, and in um, these discontinuous days of creation, right, I'm going to declare, okay, now the thing that I made 14 billion years ago has a function suddenly. Like, I think things inherently have their function when you make them.
Right.
I don't think that God declaring it has a function uh, changes anything about the thing. And I think that's the point of Walton's view is he's saying God's not actually doing anything in the days of creation, any physical thing, right? He's not changing anything in the physical world, right? He's just making a declaration like, okay, here's this thing that I put into the Big Bang and it worked out this way all the way to where it is now. Now I'm saying it suddenly has a purpose. Well, uh,
He
purpose
tries
in
to,
biology would have what?
I was gonna say he tries to say that like that the focus of Genesis 1 is not on material creation, and that sort of thing. He tries to say that this is not the focus of it. And one of the things he does, he'll point to ancient Near Eastern literature and try to say, see there, their purpose is not functional. And then if you actually look at it, or not materialistic, but if you actually look at it, it actually is about materialistic. Like, for example, like in the case of the famous example of the the Babylonian epic of creation, Tiamat is torn in half, and then half of it's created the world, and half of it's created the universe. And so it's actually very materialistic. So it's like he's just kind of cherry picking what he likes from these ancient Near Eastern literature, and then just kind of ignoring the rest of it.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. As I said, I need to read that book because a lot of people talk
Yeah,
about it. So,
yeah. But
I
it's
have read
easily.
William Lane.
Go ahead.
I have read William Lane Craig's book, as you know, and I've also read Joshua Swaminathan's book, Genealogical Adam and Eve. Um,
I haven't read that one yet.
I
I
think
need to
I
get it.
mentioned. Oh
Go ahead.
yeah, honestly, it could have been a long article, um, but. I do mention Craig in this paper because Craig presented a response to Murray and Churchill's mere theistic evolution. And in his paper, Craig presents a slightly different idea, and it's mostly in support of theistic evolution, which is why I think Craig is actually a theistic evolutionist now, probably. Where before I would have said he was an old Earth creationist of some kind, but he says he disagrees with theistic evolution on scientific grounds rather than theological. Um, but the way that he wants to use Molinism to resolve the issue um, suggests to me that if there's a difference between his view and a theistic evolutionist view, I can't see it. So, but Craig suggested that a possible resolution to the contradiction is that um, the disciplines of science and theology do not mean the same thing when they use the word random, specifically in evolutionary biology. So he gives a definition of random from Francisco Ayala, who Craig debated in 2013 on intelligent design as a viable scientific theory, I think was the topic of the debate. Um, but through that, Craig realized that Ayala's definition of random in random mutations is not. the same thing as what we would mean by random when we're talking about theological or philosophical terms, where we say, where I think the best philosophical definition of real randomness is something being uncaused. I mean, it doesn't have a cause when it occurs, meaning there is contingency, meaning more than one thing could happen, and the thing that actually does happen does not have a cause for it to happen that way versus the other way. Okay. Whereas the definition from Ayala in evolutionary biology is just random with respect to um, the benefit to an organism. Okay. Now, that does not mean what I call ontological randomness, that is, uncaused events. All that means is mutations are random with respect to their effect on the organism. And that's all that evolutionary theory means by random. So Craig thinks that this is a resolution to the issue because it just means, well, what they mean by random in evolutionary biology is not the same thing as what we mean by random in philosophy, and so there's no contradiction here. Now, I go into some detail in the paper as to why I think Craig is wrong on this. And that's because that is the typical definition of random mutations that is given by biologists, but it is not, in my view, the philosophically precise definition of what is meant by random in evolutionary biology and in science in general, actually. When we don't have to be just evolutionary biologists to want to model mutations. Mutations occur. We observe them occurring. Okay. So uh, anyone can use a random model of mutations, even if you're not an evolutionist. And so what I am sort of trying to argue in the paper is that um, the random model of mutations does not simply mean random irrespective of the effect on the organism. It actually means also in science random with respect to the type of mutation and the position of the mutation in a DNA sequence. Okay. This is what we understand mutations to be today. Now, it wasn't the case when Darwin made his theory. That's true, because he didn't know about DNA. This is part of science now. And this is how explicitly evolutionists model mutations, is when they model a mutation occurring randomly, what they're actually modeling is we don't specify where this mutation is in a genetic sequence um, by type, right? So obviously you can't have an A to T mutation in DNA if there's already a T there, right? So there's for each type of mutation, there's specific positions in a DNA sequence where it could occur. And that's why I mean by type, okay? So for each position where a certain type of mutation could occur, for all those positions, a random model of mutations says there's nothing specifying whether it occurs at this position where it could occur or another position where it could occur. That's what a random model of mutations means. And so what that in implies further about the evolutionary model is that regardless of what you think about ontological randomness, that is uncaused events, right? Um, it is still the case that in evolutionary theory, mutations are not specified with respect to their position and type in a sequence. Now, if you were God and you were trying to use evolution to create, what is the one thing you would have to do to fit the Christian doctrine of creation that I said earlier? That is, to achieve your intended outcome without the possibility of failing to do so. The one thing you would have to do would be to specify the position of each mutation in a sequence. Why? Because the position is everything. The In order for God to achieve his intended outcome, biologically, he would have to specify the final intended sequence of DNA, at least within a range, right? It would have to be within some range. Okay, there was need to be a certain number of sequences that are acceptable according to his plan, right? And he would have to make sure that one of those intended sequences is the intended outcome that it actually occurs. And so he has to specify specifically, he has to exclude from possibility, not just in reality, from possibility, a massive number of sequences from being the case. Okay. So that it specifies a range of sequences within which his intended outcome can occur. Okay. And the only way to do that is to prevent certain mutations from occurring with respect to their position in the genome. And evolutionary theory does not model mutations that way. Okay. Now, since I'm a little old-fashioned, I remember the days when theistic evolutionists used to argue that, well, this is what natural selection does, right? Natural selection limits um, or excludes certain genetic sequences from existing. And so by instituting the law of natural selection, God made sure that his intended outcome would be the result. The problem today is that there are scientific problems with claiming that natural selection just is pretty much known now not to be able to resolve um, these problems to the required specificity. Natural selection is not powerful enough to do the job that Darwin thought it could do.
It's not a
And
creative
so,
process.
right, it can't do what God would need it to do in order to specify his intended outcome. Okay, it just doesn't work. And so what I think theistic evolutionists like Murray and Churchill are trying to do is trying to salvage theistic evolution without appealing to selection as the determining factor of how God creates things, which is what you would do if you were a scientific realist and you think the theory is actually true, right? Um, so is you would, or I suppose you would, I suppose that doesn't matter here, but um, the point is that they're not, they've essentially abandoned defending natural selection as the resolution to this problem. And they're trying to come up with these other resolutions, okay? And I don't think they're going to work.
Right. Um, right.
Theologically, they're not going to work.
Have you've
Um,
studied Michael Jones's position on theistic evolution? How would you address someone like Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy? He's known wide on the internet as IP. But how would you respond to his particular view on evolution? It appears to be kind of like a cherry picked type deal where he just kind of goes through and says, "Oh, I like this, but I don't like the rest of this." And then he just kind of takes different things he likes and he just kind of puts it together in a form of an argument. What would you say? Would you maybe call his position a little bit inconsistent? Because these views often contradict each other.
I haven't specifically studied IP's actual theistic evolution position. I studied a video that he did critiquing young Earth creationism. Um, so I don't know IP's actual position here. I have looked at Redeemed Zoomer's position, which he has been on IP's show, and he might be taking it from Inspiring Philosophy. Um, you know, what I've studied of Redeemed Zoomer's position is he flat out says that God determines everything because he's a full-blown hyper Calvinist, right? He thinks everything is determined by God, which is just what I was saying earlier, that the probability of all events is one from God's background knowledge, right? He flat out says this, that everything is determined. And this means that random mutations in evolutionary theory aren't really random. I mean, that's almost a direct quote. So he's literally saying, if you're listening, the theory is false, right? Like, but they won't say that. If you try to get them to say that, and these are some of the conversations. I actually tried to engage Redeem Zoomer on this on Twitter, but I got a few other people to talk to me about it. But if you try to point this out to them, right, and say you cannot accept both as true. You can't say on the one hand that random mutations aren't really random, and the theory that depends on these random mutations is true, and I believe it, which Redeemed Zoomer explicitly says this. He says, I believe that Darwinian evolution, specifically Darwinian evolution, is what actually happened. But it appeals to random mutations, and you don't believe they're actually random. Therefore, you don't believe the theory is true. See, it's the same issue, and this is what I've kind of found is that the one thing that I think ties theistic evolutionists together, because as you said, they all have their random views. Like it's kind of like there's as many theistic evolutionary views as there are theistic evolutionists. Um, but the one thing that I think, the one argument that works against all of them is the one I'm making here, that you cannot you cannot believe two contradictory things are true in the correspondent sense. And that applies to Redeemed Zoomer, and I would predict that it applies to Inspiring Philosophy's view, if it's similar to Redeemed Zoomer, or were I to study it.
Okay. Before you leave, I was kind of curious about something. Have you studied the view that tries to argue that Genesis 1:1 should be, and a lot of theistic evolutionists use this argument, um, that claims that it should be translated as a dependent clause? You know what I'm saying?
I've not heard that before. Genesis
Inspired
1, like
one
chapter?
one. 1:1, like it says in the
Oh,
beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They will translate it when God created the heavens and the earth. The idea is not to make it as an absolute beginning point kind of thing. And some
okay.
evolutionists have tried to use that. I think there's a guy named Hasner or something like that that tries to use that and argues for that. Inspiring
Michael
philosophy,
Heiser?
and uh, Michael Jones uses that argument a lot in debates. If you ever see him in debates, he'll bring that up. But he tries to argue that as well. And some translations, like modern Jewish translations and things like that, tries to echo that theistic evolutionary interpretation of Genesis 1:1. I think can't remember his name now, but he has a paper in Answers Research Journal where he actually uh, focuses on that particular viewpoint and argues that it would actually be it'd be kind of like awkward in the Hebrew grammar. It's forcing an interpretation on the Hebrew grammar that it's just not it's you couldn't justify that linguistically. Uh, but uh, um, but there's some evolutionists that or theistic evolutionists that do hold to that viewpoint. Have you heard about that, where they try to translate Genesis 1:1 as when God created instead of in the beginning God created heavens and the earth? Because they're trying to not make Genesis 1:1 an absolute beginning point in time.
Yeah, like I said, I've not heard that. When they say when, are they applying that to the phrase in the beginning, like when in the beginning God created?
Yeah, they
Like
see like
or in
they
the
see like yeah they see like Bereshith in the beginning like it's dependent upon bra or something of that nature. Because bra is like a finite verb, so I don't see that happening. But but they try to argue that, and um, uh, they claim it's a dependent. It's called dependent clause uh, theory, or the view that Genesis 1:1 should be translated as a dependent clause instead of an independent clause, which it's usually translated as an independent clause. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, Bereshit literally means in the beginning in Hebrew. But I didn't know if you heard any. I mean, that's fine if you didn't. I was just curious because a lot of theistic evolutionists use it.
I'll have to study that further. I looked at Genesis, the Hebrew of Genesis 1 recently, and bara, the word translated created in Genesis 1:1, is also used on day 6 when they're talking about the creation of man. But it's not used, I was surprised to find out, in some of the other days. There's several words that are used, um, including just a a being verb, like it was so, right? When it says he said, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? The creation verb there is just a being verb. Um, but yeah, I haven't actually I heard that theory about bara. So is the idea that bara um, means material creation, but the dependent clause is saying this refers to the actual beginning a long time ago and not what is being described in the rest of Genesis 1? Is that what they're saying?
I think they're arguing that Genesis 1:1 is not an absolute beginning of space and time. Basically, the opposite of what most Christians would argue for, including William Lane Craig, would argue that Genesis 1:1 is an absolute beginning of space, time, and that sort of thing. Space, time, matter, everything began at that one point. And they try to argue, well, that doesn't that's not really an absolute beginning. Now they do believe that there's an absolute beginning, of course, but they try to put that before Genesis 1:1. But the object of it is that they don't think Genesis 1:1 is reflecting that absolute beginning point, and that sort of thing of time, space, time, and matter. And of course, linguistically, it's very difficult to try to hold that interpretation because it doesn't work in the Hebrew. You have to force that into the grammar. It doesn't work easily. In fact, this is something I don't think I have his book here. Another theistic evolutionist, let's see, Dr. Ben Stanhope. I don't think he's got a PhD, but Ben Stanhope. Maybe you've heard of him. He wrote a book on against Answers in Genesis a while back, and but anyway, he's appeared on IP show before, but he tries to argue that he acknowledges though that it is awkward in the Hebrew, but he thinks, oh well, I think it's true anyhow because look at these ancient Near Eastern literature. So he tries to argue for it anyhow. And that sort of thing. But he does agree that it sounds awkward in the Hebrew, like it's being forced. He just tries to understand that he thinks it happened anyway, because of what he how he understands ancient Near Eastern literature and that sort of thing. But anyway, I was just curious if you knew anything about it because I know theistic evolutionists do have used that before, and so I was wondering if you was interested in that. But yeah, that'd be something to
I
do some
am
research
now.
on it. Right. But
Yeah,
I believe it.
I always
I,
like hearing new.
right. I always believe that it should be translated as an independent clause. I think that fits the grammar the best. The Hebrew works well with it, and it's how it's been historically translated as well. In fact, the Jews originally translated Genesis 1:1 as um, as an independent clause. The only reason modern Jews, and this goes back to I think the 1980s, when they started to translate it as a dependent clause, has to do lot to do with the influence of theistic evolution. I think modern day Jews are kind of like theistic evolutionists, ain't they, nowadays?
Yeah, I listened to Ben Shapiro a lot. Here, let me see if I can fix my camera here. There we go. I listen to Ben Shapiro a lot, and he's promoted a couple books by a Jew, a modern Jew named Gerald Schroeder, that I was on my reading list. But I think he uses something about relativity to try and solve the issue. I think is my understanding, but I don't know much about that view. But yeah, theistic evolutionists think A&E, ancient Near East, is a magic word that can make the text mean whatever they want it to. Oh,
Interesting,
well,
John.
A&E literature
Right.
said this.
Interesting, John Walton
So,
believed that the truth was hidden from the church until the finding of the ancient Near Eastern literature, and now it's like the whole church did not know anything about this, about how to interpret this until they we found this ancient Near Eastern literature. So it's like, oh wow. So he believes the whole church was in ignorance until the discovery of the ancient Near Eastern literature. And now we have to interpret it the way they interpret things, and it's just not the same thing because the Jews, although they were in ancient Near Eastern literature, if I remember correctly, they basically brought the idea of history to the ancient Near East. So it's different when you see ancient Near Eastern literature, recording things because that they're not as concerned with historical events and chronology and things like that. Whereas the Jews were actually concerned with those things, and they're the ones who actually brought history to the ancient Near Eastern world. So in terms of history writing and that sort of thing. So but ancient Near East, they just weren't concerned with a lot of people in ancient Near East weren't concerned with history the same way that the Jews did. But anyway, I don't know if you wanted to speak on that or anything on.
well, that sounds right. I studied some of that when I studied William Lane Craig's book, because there's a lot of that kind of argumentation in there. But no, I just agree with you. Yeah, I've used this argument in apologetics context before. Like, so someone will say, well, back then, right, historical records were embellished to promote certain political concerns, like saying this or that king was such a great person and won all these battles and all this stuff. And the thing that's different about the Old Testament and the Jewish writing is that in the Jewish writing, even the heroes are presented as people who make mistakes all the time. Um, so, like Abraham has character flaws. He does bad things. Judah, the progenitor of the major tribe that survived. Most people calling themselves Jews today are actually descended from the tribe of Judah, which is where the term Judea comes from, which is where the term Jew comes from, right? And Judah is portrayed extremely poorly in Genesis. Uh, he he has random sex with a prostitute, who is actually tricking him to get him to perform his, at the time, his familial duties to provide his dead brother with an heir, which he refused to do. Uh, like he's not, and he, betrays his brother Joseph and later sort of redeems himself a little bit, but you know, uh, this is not consistent with the other kinds of literature, the other kinds of quote unquote history that you find in ancient Near East, where they're papering over the flaws of certain leaders and making them sound better than they really are and not recording the bad things they did. And like the Bible, the Old Testament just isn't like that, you know? It's exactly what you were saying. So,
Yeah. And of course, David was a man after God's own heart. By the very Bible itself says that he was a man after God's own heart, but yet he commits a sin with Bathsheba. And you got situation like with
and
Noah, right, following right after the flood, and he gets naked, and his son looks upon his shame, gets drunk, and it's like immediately following after the flood. So I'm just like, okay, you don't expect this kind of thing in fictional writing because you tend to want to make your heroes in a good, cast them in a good light. You don't want to sit there and emphasize their flaws too much or something of that nature.
yeah. One more thing I was thinking about that dependent clause argument is that it kind of sounds like the gap theory, except that the gap is before Genesis 1 verse 1 instead of after.
That's a really big gap.
There's a big gap before Genesis 1:1. It's like the new version of the gap theory.
Right. But yeah, they just kind of like they're now the people that take this position may still argue like inspiring philosophy or something like that would still argue for ex nihilo, like you said on William Lane Craig's view, and I think this is also true of John Walton's view. They would try to argue that the New Testament supports ex nihilo, and so we don't have to point to Genesis 1:1. I think me and you talked about this before when we were talking about William Lane Craig, but yeah, the New Testament itself points to Genesis 1:1 as the proof of ex nihilo. So it's just kind of like doesn't make no sense to say, well, the New Testament reference is true, but the reference they're alluding to isn't, or at least not in the conventional sense of truth. All right, this has been really, really good. Thank you for coming on here. And when is your paper supposed to come out?
I don't know. Whenever the second issue this year of Journal Creation comes out, I've been checking now and again. I'm expecting it any time. So just check out Journal of Creation and
Is it going to be open
see
access
when
or is
the
it
second. No, it's not open access, but what they told me is that they wait about 6 months or something like that, or a year or something, and then they put a lot of the articles online for free. So I'm expecting my article to eventually be open access on their website, creation.com. But that may not be for another year, year and a half, something like that, six
right?
months. I don't know.
Right. All right. This has been great talking to you. I'm glad we were able to cover some specifics. We got through some definition of theistic evolution. Uh, uh, I believe your argument does work because you're taking what they're willing to agree. All theistic evolutionists are willing to agree on that and saying, okay, now we got a contradiction here that doesn't seem to work with what y'all are claiming. Um, and 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 that sort of thing. And we haven't really talked too much about um, the biblical aspect in terms of theistic evolutionists. I know theistic evolutionists would say that something to the effect of that the Bible itself doesn't speak for or against evolution. I think that's how they would try to relay it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they they use the two books argument a lot where they say that this goes back to Augustine that the Bible is the book of special revelation and nature is general revelation, and they're not talking about the same things. It's just kind of where it's kind of the Noma idea comes up again, non-overlapping magisteria, whereas like the Bible is not a science textbook, they'll say all the time. And we were like, well, we agree, but it's a history book. And insofar as science claim makes historical claims, those claims can overlap with truth claims in the Bible. Um, and that's generally, I think, has to be the case. But theistic evolutionists will want to say, like you said, they'll want to say, well, these particular claims in the Bible are not historical claims, and therefore they don't contradict historical claims coming from science. And so that's why theistic evolutionists, they generally take a fictional or view of at least Genesis 1 through 11. They say
And
it's not actual really it's not really history, right?
some would argue that it's myth history, but then they just kind of have a different definition of myth. We've talked about that before, so we're not going to get into that again. But essentially, that they would try to argue that it's a myth literature, but they would not define myth as untrue, and so that just kind of it's a very awkward way of saying it because it's weird. Because if you try to address them, it's like, wait a minute, you're saying that you're not claiming it didn't happen, but you're saying it didn't happen that way. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And you're still saying it's true. How can you say it's true and then say it's didn't happen that way? So it's kind of all. It's like
Yeah, this
go ahead.
I was just going to say this is why I prefer to critique theistic evolutionists internally according to their own views, because what I think they're really doing is they're trying to come up with excuses, the same way that um, you know, a 14-year-old comes home at 2 a.m. and their parents are there waiting for them and they're asking, "Why did you break your curfew?" The 14-year-old is going to come up with all these excuses, right? And that's to me what theistic evolutionists sound like when they try to interpret the Bible, is they sound like they're making up a bunch of excuses. And so what I want to do is I want to assume their view, and I believe I will find an internal contradiction in it because it's not designed to come up with a holistic view of the text of Genesis 1 or Genesis 1 through 11. It's designed to make a specific excuse that this here we don't have to believe actually occurred historically. Because what we actually believe is what we think science is telling us. What our belief is that science is saying this, and we want to take that as true. And where it appears to contradict, we're going to deny the contradiction and then come up with some excuse for why this is not really a historical claim in the Bible.
Okay.
And if you take those those attempts to do that and work them out all the way and just apply them consistently to biblical interpretation, you will find things that don't work.
I get what you're trying to do. It's basically a reductio ad absurdum argument. You're saying okay. Even if I took that position, your conclusion is rendered absurd because of this and that. And so essentially, you're doing what's called a reductio ad absurdum argument in order to show that their conclusion ultimately leads to an absurd conclusion. Your
Yeah, that
position
was
leads to.
one of the things with Craig is he kept saying all these things to get around certain arguments in Genesis 1 through 11. And if you apply those same uh, textual critiques to any other passage, it suddenly makes no sense. And so he eventually started saying publicly that, look, my analysis is only meant for Genesis 1 through 11. Yeah, because if you try to use that kind of tech method of textual interpretation anywhere else, uh, it means you stop believing all kinds of things that the Bible says
Yeah. A
happened
lot.
historically.
A lot of old Earth creationists do that too. They'll say, "Well, is there something special about Genesis that we just have to interpret it differently than the rest of the Bible?" It's like you don't take the same principles of hermeneutics, the same way of interpreting Genesis that you're trying to take, and you don't apply it to the rest of Scripture. I mean, you're having a double standard here. Like you're applying one set of interpretations for Genesis and a different set of standards for everything else in the Bible. And so it's not a very consistent way of interpreting the scriptures. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and let you go. We've been in this
Agreed.
a while now. Um, I am so glad you're able to do this. I know you've been sick, and so we do appreciate it very much. And thank you for joining us on there.
Thank you for asking me to come on again. It's always a pleasure. I enjoy talking about this stuff, especially with people who care about it and know a lot about it, like you do. So it's been fun.
Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Well, if do you have anything final to add? Anything that you might want to say to the audience before you have to go? And just to let them know what is your conclusion on all this, and all just take all your research and just kind of briefly reference what is your thoughts on it, your final thoughts on this, in connection with theistic evolution.
Well, I think if your goal is to reconcile scientific evidence and the Bible, you basically have four options. One option is to say the Bible is false and wrong. That's sort of like the atheist evolutionist option. Um, the three Christian options are theistic evolution, which we talked about today, old earth creation, and young earth creation. So that my position is young earth creation, that the Bible and Genesis especially, from front to back, is an accurate history of the world. Um, and so we should be looking for scientific evidence that corroborates that history, to reconcile science and the Bible. That our goal should be to come up with scientific evidences and explanations for what we think is objectively happened and was recorded and witnessed and recorded in the Bible. Um, the other options are not so good. Theistic evolution has the problem. I think the main problem with it is the one I talked about today, is that it is theologically and philosophically untenable, uh, because it cannot reconcile the theory of evolution with the doctrine of creation. And that is a serious theological problem. Um, it has scientific problems as well. They're more complicated, but I think the main issue is it has a theological, philosophical, or analytical theological problem that it cannot resolve. Old Earth creationism has other problems. Their biblical interpretation is often ad hoc. Try to reconcile the history in Genesis, especially Genesis 1 through 11, as an actual history, as opposed to a myth, right? Where you're saying this is actual history, and you try to reconcile it with the scientific history, you're going to run into some problems because scientific claims are always changing. And so your reconciliation is going to get out of date, as has happened to some aspects of the reasons to believe model. Um, and in general, I think that the young Earth creation view is a better view from just in general, because what we're trying to do is trying to reinterpret scientific evidence and essentially change the scientific explanations of the data that we observe. And that, I think, is a more promising avenue for resolving this apparent issue, because science changes and the Bible doesn't. That's the
Right.
main issue for me. So,
Right. Thank you again for coming on here and discussing this. I've been wanting to have a discussion for a while on theistic evolution. I could find anyone that I could be able to have on my channel for a little bit, and I've been, but so it is great that you came on there. I know you've been studying the issue of theistic evolution for a while, and I actually didn't realize that you were publishing a article in the creation journal of creation until you brought it up to me and referenced it. So it happened at the right time that you just happened to in the process of publishing that particular article. And so that works out great. We define what theistic evolution is, and we also showed why it's internally inconsistent and does not work as a result. So it's great, and we even dealt with some specifics as well. So thank you again for joining me on here. I really do appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. Maybe if you do happen to study John Walton's position and maybe even the Pentecost thing, if you do actually end up evaluating it, give me a holler and we'll have you back on there to discuss some of those details if you have some additional stuff to say on that.
Sure thing. I'd love to.
Awesome. All right. I hope you feel better. I do. Um, we'll be praying for you so you feel better. Um, um, I hope you saw a doctor for that cough.
No, it's just a flu, but with the COVID variants, they seem to hang on with the cough a little longer than the old influenza flu. So that's what I'm dealing with right now.
All right. Thank you for again coming on here. We appreciate it. So, if you have nothing else to add, we'll go ahead and end the discussion and we'll talk later.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Nice to see you today.
You too. Thank you again for joining us on here for theistic evolution being refuted and responded to with Ben Kissling, and I appreciate Ben, and I hope he gets better. He did sound quite sick, so he is quite sick. So I'm very appreciative that he was still able to do this with us despite how he was feeling. And so all you Christians out there, make sure you be in prayer for him that he gets better. But I am so happy that he did this for us, and we learned a lot. We learned okay what basic theistic evolution is, and how to respond to it. He does a internal critique of theistic evolution, show how it's incompatible, it's inconsistent with itself, and it's a wonderful way of quickly responding to somebody that is a theistic evolutionist that you want to talk to about the issue. Of course, you can delve into specifics. Theistic evolutions have quite a bit of differences between themselves. So, what Ben focuses on is the basic similarities that all theistic evolutionists will agree to, and then critiques that into kind of an internal critique using, I guess, a reductio ad absurdum argument. So it was cool to see that happening, and it's actually an easy argument that that a person can use on a normal basis. Just if someone is talking to a theistic evolutionist, and they want, and I mean, you could delve into all these specifics and differences, um, but in order to do that, you pretty much have to find out what that specific theistic evolutionists believe on those topics. Does he take John Walton's position? Does he take William Lane Craig's? Does he take some other theistic evolutionist position on it? Does he have his own views on it? Does he argue for ancient Near East literature as being the interpretive grid to Genesis 1 to 11? And that sort of thing. So you'd have to get those kinds of specific details out of them. Um, but if you just want to provide a real quick general response, you're just in a conversation with a theistic evolutionist, this is the kind of response you would probably be able to have, because you can do that in just a few minutes time. Show how it is incompatible with itself, it's inconsistent with itself, and leads to a conclusion that's absurd. So again, I thank Ben for coming on here despite his health, and I appreciate it very much. And if you guys want to have more from Apologetics 101, if you're not subscribed already, make sure you subscribe. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. That helps YouTube get this information out there to more people. Don't forget to drop a comment below. Hit the notification bell. That will alert you of any future videos that I have. I have more in store coming up. I have a new mini series starting this month, the Tompkins Controversy Revisited, my first ever mini series, and I have a supernatural series I'm going to be doing later on as well, down the road. I haven't got a set date for that one yet, because I kind of had to push that one up because I was going to do this mini series this month. And of course, I've got lots and lots of videos planned up already, lots of interviews planned up for the month of August. So can't wait. I'm going to be really busy in August. I'll be doing a lot of editing too. I dropped several videos recently, including a heat problem video, the death of the heat problem. Make sure you watch that. I threw out my own personal model on the heat problem, which so far has not been refuted yet. I've had seen critics try their best to refute that model, and they've not yet done it. So that is an awesome model. So if you guys wanted a response that actually works and is strong, and so far it can't be refuted by critics. It's critic proof. So I would suggest you go and see my model. It is awesome. Go to the depth of the heat problem. It is an incredible model for sure. But anyway, thank you for joining me on here, and I will see you on the next one.